A nurse's routine walk home turns deadly when she confronts danger to save a stranger, sparking a chain of events that leads to a shocking presidential summons. Welcome to Life Bond Tales. Like and share the story. Enjoy the story. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass doors of Mercy General Hospital, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum, the sound swallowed by the hum of the city night beyond. The cool air of Riverside Park greeted her like an old friend, sharp and cleansing after a grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency room. At 28, Sarah was a quiet force, her hazel eyes bright with empathy, her dark ponytail swinging, as she adjusted the worn straps of her backpack. She was the nurse who lingered after her shift to hold a patient's hand, who tucked granola bars into interns' lockers, who hummed old lullabies to soothe a frightened child. Her colleagues called her the heart of the trauma ward, though she'd blush and wave off the compliment, insisting she was just doing her job. Tonight had tested her, a toddler's fever spiking dangerously, a construction worker's mangled hand requiring delicate stitches, an elderly woman whispering thank you before her breaths faded to stillness. Each moment clung to Sarah like a shadow, heavy but grounding reminders of why she chose this life. Her walk home through the park was her ritual, a 15-minute stretch of winding paths and familiar benches where the city's chaos softened into rustling leaves and distant traffic. The stars peeked through the canopy of oaks, and the faint gurgle of the old stone fountain near the park's center usually brought her peace. But tonight, as she neared the fountain, a flicker of movement under a broken streetlight stopped. Her cold. 3 men loomed over a fourth, their shadows jagged against the cracked pavement. The older man, his hair silver and his frame slight, wore a threadbare jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders. He stumbled as one of the men, broad and hooded, shoved him hard, sending him to his knees. Another, wiry and sneering, kicked his legs out, toppling him fully to the ground. The third, young and twitchy, laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that echoed in the quiet park. Sarah's stomach twisted, her nurse's instincts screaming. This wasn't a drunken argument or a petty scuffle. It was a deliberate attack, raw and vicious. The older man curled into himself, arms shielding his head, his silence more haunting than any cry for help. Her pulse surged, a mix of fear and resolve, but her feet moved before her mind could argue, carrying her toward the scene with the same urgency she'd felt rushing to a crashing patient. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the night, like a blade sharp enough to make the men freeze. The tallest, his face half hidden by his hood, turned toward her, his lips curling into a sneer. "Mind your business, lady," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Sarah's heart hammered, but she stepped closer, her blue scrubs still flecked with antiseptic, her hospital ID badge glinting faintly under the dim light. "He's done nothing to you. Walk away." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. At her sides clenched into fists. The youngest of the 3, his eyes wild and bloodshot, twitched like a live wire, his hand darting to his pocket. "You want trouble?" he spat, his voice high and unsteady, betraying nerves or something worse. "Drugs." "Maybe." Sarah stood her ground, her gaze locked on his, her training kicking in. Stay calm, de-escalate, protect, back off, now. The words hung in the air, taut as a pulled string. Time seemed to slow, the park's quiet amplifying every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant wail of a siren, the ragged breathing of the man on the ground. Then in a blur the young man lunged, a flash of metal glinting in his hand. Sarah barely registered the knife before a searing pain tore through her abdomen, sharp and deep, stealing her breath. She gasped, stumbling backward, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach as warm blood seeped through her fingers, soaking her scrubs in a spreading crimson stain. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold pavement, the rough surface scraping her cheek as she fell. The world tilted, colors bleeding into one another, the stars above swimming in and out of focus. The attackers scattered, their footsteps pounding into the distance, swallowed by the night. Shouts erupted around her, a woman's scream piercing the air, a man yelling into a phone, "Call 911, now!" Sarah's vision blurred, but she felt hands on her, a stranger's voice, urgent and close. Stay with me, stay awake." Her body trembled, the pain overwhelming, a white-hot pulse that drowned out everything else. Yet in the haze, her mind clung to one image, the older man by the fountain, his helpless form etched in her memory, his eyes wide with fear and something else, gratitude, as she'd stepped in. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he was there, only that he needed her, and that was enough. The sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the fog in her head, and she felt hands lifting her, voices overlapping in a frantic chorus. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a battle, but her purpose held her like an anchor, refusing to let her slip away. As the ambulance doors slammed shut somewhere beyond her fading senses, Sarah's last thought was of the man she'd tried to save, and a single quiet question. Was he okay? The ambulance tore through the city, its sirens screaming as it sped toward Mercy General Hospital, carrying Sarah Mitchell back to the place she'd left only moments ago. Inside, the world was a blur of motion and sound. Paramedics shouting vitals, the rattle of equipment, the steady beep of a heart monitor, struggling to keep pace with her fading pulse. Sarah lay on the stretcher, her blood-soaked scrubs clinging. To her skin, the pain in her abdomen a relentless fire that threatened to pull her under. Her colleague Mark, a paramedic who'd shared countless coffee-fueled nights with her in the break room, leaned over her, his hands trembling as he applied pressure to the wound. "Sarah, you hear me? You're gonna be okay," he said, his voice cracking despite his training. Her hospital ID, still clipped to her collar, swayed with the ambulance's motion, a cruel reminder that she was one of them, a nurse, not a patient. Or at least she wasn't supposed to be. The radio crackled with urgency. Incoming, stab. Wound mid-abdomen, female 28, critical. Victim is Nurse Sarah Mitchell. ETA 1 minute. At Mercy General, the emergency room froze for a heartbeat when her name hit the airwaves. Nurses stopped mid-step. Doctors glanced up from charts. An orderly dropped his mop. "Sarah?" "Our Sarah," whispered a nurse named Jenna, who'd laughed with her over bad cafeteria food just yesterday. Then chaos erupted. The double doors burst open and the stretcher flew in, paramedics rattling off stats. BP 70/40, heart rate 148, tachycardic, losing blood fast. Dr. Claire Evans, the attending trauma surgeon, snapped on gloves, her face, a mask of focus, but her eyes betraying the shock of seeing Sarah. Sarah, who always stayed late to check on post-op patients, who remembered everyone's birthdays. Clear Bay 3. Claire barked, and the team sprang into action, wheeling Sarah into the trauma bay under blinding white lights. Her scrubs were cut away, revealing the jagged wound, blood pooling beneath her like spilled ink. Monitors screamed warnings as her pressure plummeted, her skin pale and clammy. "She's one of ours," a nurse muttered, voice thick with emotion as she slammed in a second IV line. Jenna, stationed at Sarah's head, brushed a blood-streaked strand of hair from her forehead, whispering, "Sarah, you're here. We've got you." But Sarah was slipping, her eyes fluttering, barely open, her breath shallow and ragged. In the haze between consciousness and darkness, her mind drifted, not to the pain or the fear, but to fragments of her life. She saw the first patient she'd ever saved, a teenage girl from a car wreck, gripping her hand so tightly it left marks. She saw her nursing school graduation, her mother's tearful smile, her father's proud nod. She saw the stroke patient she'd sung to at 3 a.m., his trembling hand calming under her voice. These moments flashed like lightning, cutting through the fog. Not in order, but vivid, each one a thread tying her to the world. The team worked with desperate precision. Fluids pumped, blood bags hung, epinephrine pushed. "She's going into hypovolemic shock," Claire said, her voice steady but urgent. "Get her to the OR, now." Jenna sprinted to the hall, yelling for transport, her hands shaking as she fought back tears. Sarah's body lay limp, her once steady hands motionless, her chest rising weakly under the oxygen mask. The room was a storm of action, but for those who knew her, it was personal. This wasn't just a patient, this was Sarah, who'd brought donuts for the night crew, who'd stayed 5 hours past her shift to sit with a dying man so he wouldn't be alone. Her blood ran off the stretcher, staining the floor, and every drop felt like a betrayal of the life she'd poured into others. Then the monitor flatlined, a shrill, deafening wail that stopped every heart in the room. Jenna bit her lip, tears spilling despite her efforts as she positioned the ambu bag over Sarah's face. Starting compressions, another nurse shouted, pressing rhythmically on Sarah's chest. Claire's eyes flicked to the monitor, then to Sarah, her jaw tight. "Crash cart now," she ordered, but her voice held a flicker of something softer, fear, maybe, or refusal to lose her. 1 minute passed, then 2, the room thick with tension, a nurse whispering, "Come on, Sarah, please." The team fought as if their own lives depended on it, because in a way they did. Sarah wasn't just a colleague, she was their anchor, the one who made the unbearable bearable. Then a flicker, a single beat, then 2, a fragile rhythm clawing. "It's way back, she's got a pulse," Jenna cried, her voice breaking as the monitor beeped to life. Gasps filled the room, a surge of hope snapping the team back into motion. "Oars ready." A surgical tech called from the hall, and the stretcher surged forward, doors slamming open as they raced through the corridors. Jenna ran beside Sarah, clutching her hand, whispering, "You're doing this, you're staying with us." Claire shouted orders, prep for laparotomy, type and cross for more blood. But Sarah was somewhere else, her mind adrift in that liminal space. She saw a child's tiny hand in hers, a mother's relieved tears, a patient's smile after a long night. These weren't just memories, they were her purpose, the reason she couldn't let go. As the OR doors loomed, Claire leaned close, her voice low and fierce. "Sarah, you don't get to leave us. Fight." Then the world went dark, the sounds of the hospital fading, but that spark inside Sarah burned on, fragile but unyielding, carrying her toward the next battle. Sarah Mitchell's eyes fluttered open to a soft blur of light, the steady beep of a heart monitor, pulling her from the depths of unconsciousness. She lay in an ICU bed at Mercy General Hospital, her body heavy, her abdomen a dull throb beneath, layers of bandages. The room was a kaleidoscope of color. Flowers in every shade lined the windowsill. Cards and balloons crowded the counter, their brightness stark against the sterile white walls. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked, but the quiet hum of the hospital grounded her, a familiar rhythm she'd known as a nurse, not a patient. She blinked slowly, her gaze settling on Emily, her friend and fellow nurse, who sat beside her, gripping her hand with a tired but radiant smile. "Hey, you're back," Emily whispered, her voice thick with relief, her eyes glistening under the fluorescent lights. Sarah tried to speak, but only a faint croak escaped. Emily offered her ice chips, the coolness soothing her parched throat. "The man from the park," Sarah managed, her voice barely audible, her mind clinging to the image of the older man she'd shielded. Emily's smile widened, a spark of something knowing in her eyes. "He's safe, Sarah. You saved him." Relief washed over Sarah like a tide, her chest rising with a shaky breath, the weight of that truth heavier than the pain in her side. She didn't know his name, only that he'd been alone, outnumbered, and she'd acted without thinking, her body moving faster than her fear. The room felt smaller now, the flowers' scent, roses, lilies, lavender, mingling with antiseptic, grounding her in the moment. Nurses slipped in and out, checking vitals, adjusting drips, their faces, familiar yet strange colleagues who'd seen her at her strongest, now tending to her fragility. A doctor, one she'd worked alongside in countless traumas, nodded approvingly at her chart, his usual gruffness softened by a quiet reverence. "You're tougher than you look, Mitchell," he said, and Sarah managed a weak smile, her first since the attack. Hours passed, the morning light filtering through half-closed blinds, casting stripes across the floor. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body fighting to heal, her mind replaying the park, the glint of the knife, the older man's helpless form, the chaos of voices as she fell. Each time she woke, Emily was there, or another nurse, or an orderly, who'd once teased her about her terrible coffee-making skills. The hospital buzzed with whispers of her story, staff pausing in hallways to share hushed updates, their pride tinged with disbelief. Sarah wasn't just a patient, she was their own, a symbol of the courage they all hoped to carry. By midday, the air in her room shifted, a subtle charge like the calm before a storm. A knock came, firm but not rushed, and a man stepped inside. Mid-40s, crisp black suit, his presence commanding yet understated. He wasn't hospital staff, nor press, nor police. His demeanor carried the weight of something official, something beyond the walls of Mercy General. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice steady, respectful, "I'm David Carson with the Office of the President." Sarah's heart skipped, her brows knitting together as she propped herself up slightly, wincing at the pull of her stitches. He stepped closer, pulling a cream-colored envelope from his coat, its deep blue seal embossed with gold, the unmistakable crest of the President of the United States. "May I?" he asked, and she nodded, her fingers trembling as she took the envelope, breaking the seal with care. The letter inside was on heavy parchment, the words formal yet warm addressed to her. "To Miss Sarah Mitchell, it is with profound gratitude and admiration that I thank you for your extraordinary courage. Your selfless act in defending another, at great personal cost, reflects the highest values of this nation. The man you saved is a dear friend, a patriot, and a decorated veteran. I invite you to the White House to personally express my appreciation and honor your heroism. Respectfully, the President of the United States." Sarah read it twice, her breath catching, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between that dark park and this moment. She looked up at Carson, her voice barely a whisper. "Who was he? The man I saved?" Carson's expression softened, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "His name is Colonel James Harrow, retired U.S. Marine, Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart, served 3 tours and a trusted advisor to multiple administrations. He's a close friend of the President. They served together decades ago." Sarah's heart thudded, the name sinking in, heavy with meaning. She'd had no idea, no clue who he was when she'd run toward danger, only that he was a person, vulnerable, and in need. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from pain but from the overwhelming truth. She'd changed a life, not just any life, but one woven into the fabric of the nation's history. Carson continued, his tone gentle. "Colonel Harrow's been calling for updates on you. He's recovering thanks to you, and he wanted me to tell you, you saved a Marine who's too stubborn to quit." Sarah laughed softly, the sound cracked but warm, easing the tension in the room. Carson stepped back, giving her space. "The President wanted you to know the impact of what you did. You didn't just save a man, you sent ripples through places most never touch." He nodded respectfully and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Sarah sat still, the letter in her lap, its words blurring through fresh tears. Outside, the hospital carried on, codes called, monitors beeping, lives saved. But in her room, time slowed. She traced the seal with her finger, her mind reeling. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought recognition, yet here it was, a gratitude so vast it felt surreal. Emily returned, sitting quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. "You okay?" she asked, and Sarah nodded, though her eyes told a different story, one of awe, humility, and a quiet resolve to carry this forward, whatever it meant. The flowers around her seemed brighter now, each one a testament to the lives she'd touched, knowingly or not, and the letter in her hands a bridge to a future she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the black government-issued SUV, her navy blue dress catching the faint breeze as she blinked against the bright Washington, D.C. afternoon. The stitches in her abdomen tugged with each movement, a quiet reminder of the night that had changed everything. But she stood tall, her dark hair neatly pinned, a simple gold necklace resting against her collarbone. The White House loomed ahead, its iconic facade both grand and surreal, a place she'd only seen in photos as a child on a school trip. Now, at 28, she was no tourist. She was an invited guest, her name carried on a letter sealed with the President's crest. Her heart raced, not from fear but from the weight of a moment she hadn't sought. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, gave her a respectful nod as he opened the door, his silence a steadying presence. Security agents checked, credentials with practiced efficiency. Their nods brisk as the SUV rolled through the gates. Sarah's hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope she'd read a dozen times since that hospital room. The city blurred past, monuments, bustling streets, the pulse of power. But inside the vehicle, her world was quiet, her thoughts a tangle of disbelief and resolve. She'd been a nurse, not a hero, yet here she was, summoned to the heart of the nation. As the SUV stopped at the south portico, an aide greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Mitchell, welcome," he said, extending a hand. She stepped out, her legs steady despite the faint ache in her side, and cameras snapped from a distance, reporters murmuring her name. She kept her chin up, her steps measured, ignoring the pull of her healing scar. The White House hallways gleamed, their polished floors reflecting flags that lined the corridors, each step echoing with history, presidents, diplomats, and now her, a nurse from Riverside Park. The aide led her through glass doors to the Rose Garden, where rows of chairs faced a podium adorned with the presidential seal. The crowd was small but significant. Dignitaries in crisp suits, officials with pinned lapels, and to her surprise, familiar faces. Her parents, her mother's eyes already wet, her father's jaw set with pride. Colleagues from Mercy General, their smiles a mix of awe and joy. At the center stood the president, his navy suit immaculate, his smile genuine, and beside him, in full Marine dress uniform, stood Colonel James Harrow, the man she'd saved. His posture was ramrod straight, his silver hair catching the light, but his eyes held a warmth that made Sarah's breath catch, gratitude, unspoken but profound. The president stepped to the podium, cameras zooming in as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "we gather today not for politics but for courage, raw, undeniable courage." He turned to Sarah, gesturing for her to join him. She walked forward, her heart pounding, the crowd's eyes on her like a spotlight. The applause began, not loud, but reverent, a sound that resonated in her chest. She stood beside the president, hands folded, unsure where to look, the air thick with expectation. "Sarah Mitchell is a nurse," he continued. "Not a soldier, not a leader in title, but a citizen, who, when faced with danger, ran toward it. She saw a stranger in need and acted, risking her life." He turned to Colonel Harrow. That stranger was Colonel James Harrow, a Marine who served this nation for over 3 decades, a Silver Star recipient. My friend and brother in arms. He stands here today because of her. Harrow gave a small nod, his eyes meeting Sarah's, a silent thank you passing between them. The crowd's applause grew, and Sarah's cheeks warmed, her humility clashing with the moment's weight. The president faced her directly now, his voice softening. "Sarah, your actions embody the best of us. For that, I am honored to appoint you as the new head nurse of the White House Medical Unit." The crowd gasped, then erupted in applause, and Sarah froze, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled. He handed her a small glass case, a badge gleaming inside, her name etched beside her new title. Her knees trembled, but she stood taller, the reality sinking in. And, the president added, no act of heroism should go unsupported. "On behalf of this nation, we gift you a new vehicle waiting outside these gates." Another wave of applause rolled through, and Sarah's vision blurred, tears spilling freely now. "Lastly," he said, turning to the crowd, "we offer you a new home fully furnished just minutes from here. No rent, no mortgage, just our gratitude." The audience rose to their feet, the sound overwhelming, and Sarah's breath hitched, her parents' sobs audible from the front row. The president took her hands, his voice low. "Sarah, you remind us what strength looks like. You didn't know who you were saving. You just acted. That's why we honor you." He pulled her into a brief embrace, the cameras clicking, the moment raw and real. As the applause continued, Colonel Harrow stepped forward, his medals glinting. He saluted her, crisp and formal, then surprised everyone by pulling her into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're welcome," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the tears. The ceremony drew to a close, and her parents rushed to her mother enveloping her in a tearful embrace, whispering, "I'm so proud," while her father managed a gruff, "You're incredible, kid." Aides moved to guide her toward the residence wing, but Sarah paused at the garden's edge, glancing back at the podium, the seal, the place where her life had shifted again. She wasn't the nurse who'd walked home that night. She was something. More not because of titles or gifts, but because of the choice she'd made in a split second. The rose garden glowed under the afternoon sun, and Sarah felt the weight of eyes on her, not as a spectacle but as a symbol of something rare, selfless instinct, courage without agenda. She took a deep breath, the ache in her side a quiet companion. Anne stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. Sarah Mitchell stepped into her new office in the White House Medical Unit, the faint scent of antiseptic and polished wood welcoming her like an old friend. The room was modest, tucked into the secure lower levels of the West Wing, its soft lighting casting a warm glow over a simple desk, a single chair, and a small shelf holding medical journals. A framed quote hung on the wall: "Do what's needed. Do it with grace," a gift from Emily, her friend from Mercy General, who knew Sarah's heart better than most. Her white coat hung on a rack, her new badge clipped proudly above her heart, Head Nurse, White House Medical Unit. At 28, she'd traded the chaos of the ER for a world of quiet precision, where every patient was a thread in the nation's fabric, diplomats, aides, even the president himself. Yet Sarah moved through her days with the same calm she'd carried in the hospital, her presence steadying those around her. Secret Service agents nodded as she passed, their stoic faces softening. Administrative staff offered morning smiles. Even senior advisors paused to let her through, sensing her quiet authority. Her mornings began with rounds, reviewing charts, with her small team, their efficiency honed by the high stakes of their work. Ambassador staff, full panels, no assumptions, she instructed, flipping through a clipboard, her hazel eyes sharp, catching every detail. She treated a diplomat's spouse for chest discomfort, her gentle questions easing their nerves. She monitored a Marine aide for signs of exhaustion, her firm but kind tone urging rest. She prescribed antibiotics for a speechwriter's cough, her smile reassuring. Each interaction was deliberate, her care a blend of skill and humanity, honed by years of late-night shifts and impossible cases. Between appointments, she retreated to her office, sipping peppermint tea, her gaze lingering on a photo of her parents on the desk. The scar beneath her dress tugged occasionally, a faint echo of the night in Riverside Park, but it didn't define her. Her purpose did. That purpose carried her to her new home, a cozy 2-story townhouse 10 minutes from the White House, its blue door and small porch swing a gift she still couldn't quite believe. The house smelled of cedar and lavender, a diffuser humming. Softly in the corner, a throw blanket draped over the couch. She'd arranged her books, medical texts, a few novels, letters from colleagues, on a shelf by the staircase, and a single photo from the Rose Garden ceremony hung on the wall. Her, standing between the president and Colonel Harrow, her eyes glassy but human. At night, she cooked simple meals, grilled vegetables, rice, a glass of wine, and sat on the porch, the creak of the swing blending with the city's distant hum. She journaled sporadically, her words grounding her. This life feels like a dream, but it's real because I'm still me, still helping, still here. Sarah's new rhythm extended beyond her job. Once a month she drove her gifted SUV, a sleek, practical vehicle she'd initially hesitated to accept, to a local community college where she mentored young nursing students. In a small classroom, she shared stories of real-world emergencies, the mental toll of caregiving, the balance of detachment and empathy. She never spoke of the park incident directly, but it lingered in her steady gaze, her calm voice, the way she encouraged students to trust their instincts. Fear's not the enemy, she'd say, hesitation is. Students hung on her words, not because of her title, but because she was real, a woman who'd faced death and walked away stronger. One evening, a shy student lingered after class, clutching a notebook. "You make it okay to be scared, but still try," she said, and Sarah's heart swelled, the moment worth more than any ceremony. Back at the White House, her days were a blend of routine and unpredictability. A call from the president's team summoned her to the West Wing, where she found him in his private study, surrounded by old books and lamplight. "Nurse Mitchell," he greeted, his smile warm. "I read your report on Colonel Harrow's checkup. You've given him years he didn't expect." Sarah ducked her head, deflecting the praise. "I just did what any nurse would." He chuckled. "Maybe, but not many would have done it with a knife in their side." The exchange, brief but genuine, reminded her that her work here mattered, not for glory, but for the lives she touched. When her shift ended, Sarah often walked home, declining the SUV, savoring the quiet streets. Her neighborhood was a pocket of calm, children's laughter echoing from nearby yards, the air cool against her skin. Inside her house, she'd kick off her shoes, tie back her hair, and settle into the routine of a life she was still learning to call hers. A text from Emily buzzed one night. "Sent your care package to the interns. They loved the books. Miss you. Visit soon?" Sarah smiled, replying, "Promise." Her life wasn't perfect. Nights alone could feel heavy, the weight of her new role daunting, but it was purposeful. She'd found a peace she hadn't known she needed, not in the titles or the house, but in the act of showing up, day after day, for others. One afternoon, as she left the medical unit, a woman in a business suit approached her in the hallway. "You're Nurse Mitchell, right?" Sarah paused, nodding. The woman's eyes softened. "You treated my father last month, the retired Navy man with the arrhythmia. He said you made him feel human again." Sarah tilted her head, her voice gentle. "He is human." The woman's eyes welled and she nodded, unable to speak. Moments like these, quiet and uncelebrated, were Sarah's true reward, proof that her work rippled beyond the White House walls. As weeks turned to months, she settled into her role, her scar fading, her confidence growing. She wasn't the nurse who'd walked home that night, nor the hero the world saw. She was both and neither, a woman who'd acted on instinct and found herself here, carrying her purpose like a torch. Sarah Mitchell stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at dusk, the marble glowing softly under the fading light, Washington, D.C.'s skyline stretching out before her. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms from across the tidal basin, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm, tourists snapping photos, cars weaving through distant streets. At 28, Sarah had carved a new life. As head nurse of the White House Medical Unit, her days filled with purpose, her nights spent in the quiet comfort of her gifted townhouse. Yet here, on these steps, she wasn't a title or a hero. She was just Sarah, a woman reconciling a life forever altered by one impulsive act. The scar on her abdomen, now a faint line beneath her sweater, no longer ached, but it whispered of the night in Riverside Park, when she'd run toward danger to save a stranger. She came here often, not for patriotism, but for the solace of Lincoln's solemn gaze, its stillness grounding her in a world that had spun wildly since that night. The anniversary of the attack was tomorrow, and Sarah had chosen to mark it quietly, not with sorrow but with intention. Earlier that day, she'd driven to a community center near the park, a small brick building where kids played basketball and nurses offered free clinics. In her trunk were boxes of medical books and supplies, donated anonymously, her only request a smile to the staff as she handed them over. "For the students," she'd said, her voice soft, and left before anyone could ask her name. Back home, she'd baked a peach pie from her mother's recipe, the scent of cinnamon and fruit filling her kitchen, and delivered it to a shelter down the street from where the attack had happened. She didn't linger, didn't mention who she was, just offered the pie and walked away, the act a silent reclaiming of that place, turning a memory of pain into one of giving. Now on the memorial steps, she sat with her journal, its pages worn from months of late-night reflections. She wrote, "The day I almost died is now a day I give back. It's not about erasing the past, it's about building from it." Her pen paused, her eyes tracing the city's lights, each one a life, a story, a moment like hers that could change everything. Sarah's life had found a steady cadence, a balance of duty and quiet joys. Her work at the White House was demanding but fulfilling, treating a senator's flu, calming a diplomat's child during a checkup, catching the early signs of stress in a young aide. She led her team with the same calm she'd brought to Mercy General, her instructions clear, her empathy unwavering. No shortcuts, but always kindness, she'd tell her nurses, and they listened, not because of her title, but because they saw her heart. Outside work, she'd carved out rituals, Sunday walks through her neighborhood, where children waved from porches, evenings reading novels on her porch swing, weekly calls with her parents, their voices a tether to her old life. Her mother sent recipes, Her father sent bad jokes, and both sent love that filled the spaces her new life couldn't. Sarah had become a quiet icon, though she'd never see herself that way. Strangers sometimes recognized her on the street, their eyes lingering with a flicker of awe, offering soft thank yous or respectful nods. She'd smile, deflect, and move on, uncomfortable with the spotlight. When universities or veteran groups asked her to speak, she declined, not out of shyness but principle. Her story wasn't meant for stages or microphones. It was born in instinct, lived in silence. Instead, she poured herself into mentoring, her monthly workshops at the community college, drawing eager students who saw her as a guide, not a celebrity. One afternoon, a young nurse approached her after class, her voice hesitant. "You make it feel possible to keep going, even when it's hard," she said, and Sarah's reply was simple. "It's always hard. Just don't stop." Those moments, uncelebrated and small, were her legacy, built not in headlines but in lives touched. At the White House, her presence had become a quiet force. Aides sought her out for advice, not just medical but personal, trusting her steady presence. Once, during a late shift, the president stopped by the medical unit, his tie loosened, his smile tired. "Sarah, you're the calm in this storm," he said, and she laughed, brushing it off, but his words lingered, a reminder that her work mattered in ways she'd never imagined. She kept a low profile, avoiding press, letting her actions speak. When a reporter caught her leaving the White House one day, asking for a quote, she said only, "I'm just a nurse doing my job," and walked on, her steps light but firm. Her home was her sanctuary, its walls holding traces of her journey, a photo from the Rose Garden ceremony, a stack of letters from colleagues and strangers, a small vase of dried lavender from Emily. She'd hung a second quote beside her desk. "Courage isn't loud, it's steady." It fit her, a woman who'd faced death and chosen to live quietly, fully for others. On this anniversary eve, as she sat on the memorial steps, a young woman approached, her scrubs peeking from under her jacket. "You're Sarah Mitchell, right?" she asked, nervous but earnest. Sarah nodded, bracing for the usual recognition, but the woman's eyes softened. "I'm training to be a nurse because of you. Your story, it showed me I could be brave." Sarah's throat tightened, her smile genuine. "You already are," she said, and the woman beamed, walking away with a lightness Sarah recognized, hope, raw and real. She closed her journal, the city's lights blurring through a sheen of tears, not of sadness but of clarity. The night in the park had been a spark, igniting a life she hadn't planned but now embraced. She wasn't the nurse who'd walked home that night, nor the hero the world crowned. She was Sarah, a woman who'd acted, survived, and kept going. Rising from the steps, she tucked her journal under her arm and walked toward home, the cool air brushing her face, the scar a silent companion. Tomorrow she'd return to the White House, check charts, hold hands, save lives in her quiet way. Tonight she was just a woman under the stars, carrying her purpose like a light that would never dim. The city stretched before her, alive and vast, and Sarah stepped into it ready for whatever came next.